Can't wait for vetting through.
All right, well, welcome to our next class. Just ignore the background comment there. Welcome to our our next class here on spiritual frequent confession, spiritual direction, and obedience. This is a course targeted at novices and those inquirers who are considering joining the Brotherhood. And we will go through the presentation, and then at the end of it, we will have a question time where I will answer it. If you type into the chat window before then, I may not see it because I'll have the PowerPoint up here on my screen. But other than that, we'll get started. So where we left off last time on this presentation was with a conversation on how important daily mental prayer was. And one of the things that we highlighted in that was that we needed to make daily resolutions. We needed to examine our conscience every day. We needed to make daily resolutions, that this was a part of the rule. We needed to recollect ourselves daily and think about our failings before God and weep for them. And if we're doing this, if we're being faithful to daily mental prayer, if we're daily considering our sinfulness, if we're daily considering how fallen and broken we are, then we're going to be daily and perhaps multiple times preparing for our next sacramental confession. Now, it kind of goes without saying that once you enter into the Brotherhood, we expect that you live up fully to the life of the knight. That means that your life is never a source of scandal to Christians, that you always maintain a certain degree of respectability. So certain types of moral failings, certain types of sins that are of their nature extremely grave or mortal, would not be living up to, in any way, shape, or form, the life of the knight. It is our business when they are a public matter. It is our business to know. It is a matter for correction, and it can also jeopardize any type of long-term survival within the order. So that goes without saying. Mortal sins of a nature that are private, let's say evil thoughts, for example, feelings of vengeance, vindictive behavior, things of that sort, maybe impure thoughts. Those things are, of course, contrary to the life of the knight, and we expect that through our serious sacramental life that we propose and a life of prayer, that these things should be overcome. We would, of course, prefer that anybody entering into the Brotherhood would already have any type of mortal sin of that nature already worked out, that that's not something they're going to be struggling with in the middle of their vocation. However, if it's of a private matter, it's not something you need to tell us about. It is something that your spiritual director, your confessor, needs to be aware of, and in the context of your vocation. Okay? So I'm only mentioning that because frequent confession and spiritual direction generally makes an assumption. It makes an assumption that mortal sins are not a frequent occurrence in your life. If they are a frequent occurrence in your life, it is due to some type of habitual fault that may even mitigate a grave matter down to a lower degree. But as a rule of thumb, they're not a normal matter anymore, right? Because here's the deal, and this is in our instruction of our Grand Master, his letter he sent us in 2016. It is in other documents as well. It's in our common sense as good Catholic Christians. If we are in a state of mortal sin, we must go to confession. Not at the end of the week, right now. I mean, right now. Get up and go to church, find a priest, go to confession. If it's 3 a.m. in the morning and you're afraid that there's no one available, then you need to make a resolution to go as soon as possible and to get back in the friendship of God with perfect contrition. So there's the assumption. So when we talk about spiritual direction and frequent confession, we're making the assumption that we're talking about venial sins as a rule of thumb, or the very rare mortal sin that happens. People fall, they get grievously tempted, they fall, you confess it, you move forward with your life. Okay? But as a rule of thumb, frequent confession is about overcoming habitual faults, conquering vices, and progressing in perfection, not in regularly combating mortal sins, because more or less we're lukewarm Christians who don't care except when the occasional fear of hell bubbles up in us, or our conscience gets troubled and we want to do something proactive, and we crawl ourselves into a confessional, offer a half-hearted confession without really a resolution to overcome our sins, and then we move on. Okay. I'm going to be relying heavily on a book called Frequent Confession by Abbot Benedict Barr. He was a Benedictine abbot. He wrote a number of books in the 1940s and 1950s. They're excellent. They're amazing in their quality. It's kind of like the height of like papal. It was very great. It had just encyclicals from the Pope were occasionally referenced. It was mostly biblical and patristic, monastic wisdom, very devoid of the sentimentality or the over-the-top flourishing of the Baroque period. It was kind of like the best of spiritual teaching of the 20th century before everything went to crazy. So anyway. Quote, holy souls who are advancing in spiritual life should not confess in their confessions any failings or unfaithfulness or sins of frailty which they are not fully resolved to avoid or at least to strive against. End quote. Okay, so the first thing about making your frequent confessions, by the way, just to remind you, the rule explicitly states that you must go to confession at least once a month. That means if you have no mortal sins on your soul, you still have to go to confession. Our Grand Master has added to that. In his instruction, in his letter from 2016, he asks us to go to confession once every 2 weeks at a minimum. The rule for religious under canon law, we are not religious, but it is oftentimes a very good guide, demands that every single religious has to go to confession once a week. So what do I recommend? I recommend going once a week. If you can find a confessor who will tolerate more frequently, I'd say do that, if you can get away with it. And it's helping you. St. Philip Neri used to hear layman's confessions every day. That's very monastic. Early patristic, early desert father stuff. But Grandmaster says once every 2 weeks. So you might ask, well, wait, but the rule says once a month, and the Grandmaster says every 2 weeks. Who do we obey? Well, all of our teachings and instructions fall on a spectrum, and we'll go into obedience here in a moment, but you're strictly obliged to follow the rule, and the Grand Master is strictly obliged to be followed. He's not commanded you to do something evil. He's made a good recommendation, so you're obliged, under piety, to follow his counsel. That simple. If I suggest to you, not command or bind in obedience to something, that I think it's a good idea to go every week, you can do so, and God will give you extra grace because being your superior, I made the suggestion. But you're not strictly obliged to, and your conscience should never be troubled if you don't do it. But it should be troubled if you miss every 2 weeks, and it should be very troubled if you go a month. As a novice, you need to question your commitment if you miss going to confession once a month. Okay. So, no laundry list confessions. That's the first step to making a good frequent confession. I don't want you going to the confessional and laying off 50 sins that you committed that you half-heartedly feel sorry for. Those confessions, most of them are trash. Throw them out. Okay, I'm not God. Maybe they're not trash. I think in the past of my life, before I learned more, when I came in with laundry lists of venial sins, a lot of those weren't any good. Why? Wasn't truly resolved to overcome those faults. I didn't have a practical plan. My compunction for those things were variable. It's better to show up to your frequent confession and confess one sin you're truly sorry for than to confess a bunch that you're maybe sorry for or that are habitual or something. Anyway, our guiding principle here should be a little but well done, a little done earnestly and with purpose and perseverance. Divide et impera, divide and conquer, right? St. Teresa of Avila makes the remark that if we rooted out one fault a year, we would be perfect in a short time. The Imitation of Christ says the exact same thing. If we were to uproot only one vice each year, we should soon become perfect. The contrary, however, is often the case. We feel that we are often better and purer in the first fervor of our conversion than we are after many years in the practice of our faith, the Imitation of Christ, chapter 11. Back to Benedict Barr. Holy souls who are advancing in the spiritual life should not confess in their confessions any failings or unfaithfulness or sins of frailty which they are not fully resolved to avoid or at least strive against. Okay, so what is, practically speaking, most of us probably have some type of moral failing that is a regular deal with us, right? And most of us probably also detect within ourselves occasionally behavior that is not us. For example, if you are a patient person and one week you just like fly off the handle at somebody, and that's out of character, that's a good sin to confess, right? If you're also that patient person, but maybe you're given to a proclivity of being lazy and getting things done late to the inconvenience of others, right? There's your habitual fault. This will foster humility within you if you keep going to confession with that same habitual fault that you are practically trying to overcome and you keep confessing it. I know from experience. I mean, it's really humiliating after, I don't know, a year plus of struggling against something. And your progress, and what's particularly irritating about confession is you don't go in and tell your priest how much progress you've made in overcoming your fault. It's always how often you fall into that, your fault. Okay. Spiritual director does not need to be your confessor. A priest can provide direction via phone, email, letter, in addition to in-person meetings. Okay, so all knights are obliged to have a spiritual director, period. It says so in the rule. It says that you must pick somebody to be your advisor. Okay? Practically speaking, that can be very hard. It's not a problem for anybody in this room, but in other places, anybody who's chiming in, finding a devout confessor, a man who loves penance, or who will like our order and cooperate, forming you along the rules, is no small task. But it's very important. That's why I say here that if that means you have to write to somebody, perhaps a monk or a priest at a monastery, do it. That's worked for several people. Okay. When you're going to a spiritual direction, you do not ever want to talk about your confession or your confessor, assuming they're a separate person. The latter is most strictly bound to silence what he has laid down for his penitent to meet a very special situation, often repeated by the latter out of its context. Some people go so far to suggest that it's a sin to actually talk about things done in a confession. My reading of moral theology on that, I don't agree with that. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't agree with that. But that's one of the problems with having a separate director from a confessor. Knights are actually obliged to have separate men. If you want to have the same one, you need permission. I have gotten permission twice from Italy. This falls into one of those things where you need to ask. I wrote, I got back a response right away. They're fine if you ask and you have a reason. I've always had a good reason. I've also had the situation where I had them separate, and that worked pretty well too. Sometimes, I'll give you a concrete example where that might work. Sometimes a priest is an exceptional confessor, but he does not take spiritual penitence. He doesn't direct people. And the director is somebody who has known you a long time, but now he lives far away from you and you can only see him once a quarter or once a month or whatever. That might be a situation where you might look into it. You might ask, but why do we ask people to do that? Well, according to my last spiritual director, he thinks that the reason why, and I've never asked directly, but after Vatican II, it became very common that that was the advised situation. They felt that having a director as the confessor created situations where penitents, when they confess, would feel embarrassed confessing certain sins to them, and they'd be tempted to conceal sins in confession to their director. Of course, to me, that indicates a massive problem with pride. But I guess maybe enough people saw it as a thing that they felt this was a way of fixing it. I don't know. It's happened to me on occasion when I've traveled for work or for other reasons, where, especially if you visit traditional parishes, where you'll give a confession, especially if you go in and you do a very good confession. You know, it's been a week since my last confession. You state your state of life. You give them the firm details, and it's venial sins. Oftentimes, the priest on the other side of that screen, or face to face, thinking he wants to assist you, may launch into spiritual direction on you. This has almost always been a bad thing, except when I've asked it, like on a retreat. When it's been done without me asking, it's almost always been bad. Um, the best thing to do is let him say his piece, and then if he tries to engage you, like with questions, you should just smile warmly and say, "I have a director," and try to put it down. Don't have more than one cook in the kitchen there. It's it's no good. The rule, as I said, but it is opportune and advisable for each brother to select and keep one sole spiritual advisor. Notice that one soul. I'm not kidding. And it's come up, and I've seen it where people feel like having two or three spiritual directors is a good thing. It's not. It's like it'd be like having three men as your father. What happens is you wind up running to the man that you like the most, not the one who's going to give you the medicine that you need, which is consequently the one who probably knows you the best and loves you the most to hurt you. St. Bernard, also, you can't be your own director. St. Bernard puts it very well. The man who is his own teacher is the pupil of a fool. We should generally never change our spiritual director. In general, changing spiritual directors is a bad thing, but at the same time, it is an exaggeration to represent such changing as the greatest evil in the spiritual life. Yes, you'll see that too. But mainly, that what he's referring to here is there's many writings from the monastics and from the later Baroque authors like Alphonsus um, that make changing your spiritual director, your spiritual father, like the greatest evil on earth, and like you're going to hell. I'm not kidding. But you need to understand that those things were written in a different time, in a different context, and they were dealing with a different evil. They were dealing with monks, especially in the East. In the West, we have Benedictinism, which was characterized by stability, and you stayed at your monastery. In the East, it was such a normal thing to like run from monastery to monastery, and it's still a thing today. Like they leave their monasteries all the time over observance disputes and everything else. They get real, real nasty, and they'll just quit their spiritual father if they don't like them. And of course, you can't make any progress if you're going to just run into somebody you disagree with them and then you quit them. Because really, what you become is a man who shops around for his own ideas. With that being said, today, sometimes when we're beginners in the spiritual life, we think somebody very well of somebody. And then after having them as a director for a long time, we realize that they're not helping us or there are problems there. And then maybe we should make a change. Almost every time I've made the change in my life, it's because of distance. My first spiritual director was a very kind man. And I think he was not a traditionalist, but he was very kind and very loving to me. And he was let your conscience be your guide very much. But oftentimes my conscience told me to be very strict. And so he helped me with that. He moved and we decided to end the relationship then. My next spiritual director was also my confessor, and I had a year where I was not under direction, much to my efforts to try to end that. I couldn't find somebody who I felt would direct us according to the rule. The problem you'll meet one of the things that's a terrible situation is there's lots of priests willing to give direction, but they don't want to guide us according to the rule. They want to give you their plan for spiritual advancement. And oftentimes, like certain aspects of our rule, for example, the recitation of the breviary in Latin, it's like horror to them, even traditional priests. And they can't; those men should not be your director because they've already shown you that they don't like what you're about. Okay, so and then of course, when I moved here, I picked one of the canons because once again, to have the type of intimate relationship that I was looking for advancement, I wanted that in person and very frequent contact. Okay, I have a handout on selecting a director, which I think I've given to every. I gave it to you. Did I give it to you? I'll send you an email. I'll to our brother in Washington, Peter. I will. I don't remember if I sent that to you, but if I didn't, I will. It's very helpful and it gives you all the details about what you should talk to them in direction about and so forth. Okay, so what should direction be like? And how frequently should you meet your director? You have to let you, your director is going to advise whether or not you should take your vows, both simple and solemn. So he needs to know how well you're observing things and how your life is going. How often do I think you should meet your director? I would advise once a month. If you can't do once a month, I'd advise once every 6 weeks. If you can't do that, don't do less than once a quarter. I think that's too little. But if you're seeing him for confession regularly, maybe that's enough. If he's the same person, but if he's not, I think you're not really observing direction. You're doing medical checkups. Um, I remember. I mean, I don't know what the point of direction is. Like I remember in California, there was a very large group, third order. They met their directors once a year, and I looked at that and I went, well, what is it? Like, are you committing adultery? I mean, what are you still married to your? I mean, what is it? Just like a visiting period? And clearly, not a lot can happen in a year because you can't like do these things. Come back to me next year, unless it's like the Desert Fathers stories where it's like, don't talk. I mean, if it's something like that, never eat meat again. I mean, if it's something real hard to focus on, I guess. But I would say at least once a month. I honestly, though, I mean I don't know a single priest who could probably give you more than that unless they're retired. I mean, in which case I would not advise more than a once every 2 weeks situation for direction, which will last about an hour. 30 minutes to an hour is realistic for direction. Okay. You owe your director a special holy reverence. Be sane about this. All right. The reality is we're Americans and we can't change that. And trying to observe some type of weird formality thing we read about in a French literature book from the 1700s is going to make your priest feel awkward about you, and don't do it. And don't pretend to be a desert monk. Let them have those special things, and they're very special. Let them have those things. You are a devout, hopefully. You're a man who shows attention to his religion, and you love your director. You should show him the highest reverence. Think of him as a doctor and then or a judge, right? Or as the president, and then amplify that and show him that degree of respect. You don't have to tremble before his presence, right? But you should show him a special love and attention just by the fact that he's your director, whoever he is. Okay? You should try to have a childlike trust. That's hard with anybody, especially men, American men, especially. We're not programmed to be that way. But what do I mean by childlike trust? You should feel about your director that you could go into him and say, I fell into the sins of cannibalism and insert something embarrassing and impure. And I need your help out of this pit. And you would feel like he would help you. That's the type of confidence. There's a wonderful story from the Ladder Divine Ascent that I'll repeat. Cover your ears if you're under 18. There's a story of a monk, and he talked about that they were big into spiritual fatherhood. And in the Eastern Church, they actually believed that the father took on, anytime you gave faithful confession to your elder, he took on those sins before God. Your job was to confess the sin, and your job was to pray for your father all the time. But he took on your personal sins. And this is incredible. It shows you how rustic the 6th century was. The brother had a fall with a goat. A goat. And he told his spiritual father, and his father punched him right in the face. And then he picked him up and he said, I don't want you to be troubled about this anymore. I will take these sins on me. And then the father, excuse him, never brought it up again. And the man never suffered with those temptations because he knew that that meant the father would now confront those temptations on his behalf. You see this in the lives of great saints too. In the West, St. John Vianney said he did the penance for his penitents. He was there, he gave him something to do, but he did most of it. Right? All right. You should have, that's what you're aiming for. If you don't have that, find the next best thing. At least find someone you feel like is a best friend or a close friend. And that you can at least bear enough of your soul to them for them to help you. You can even tell them that you don't feel like you can lay everything out, but you're going to give it your best shot. Our dealings with our spiritual director should be confined to what is really necessary. Do not let your time in spiritual direction become a mutual back scratching session. I've witnessed these relationships, they're disgusting. Basically, it involves you praising your spiritual director for being holy, and then him praising you for being holy, and then you agree how awful everybody else is, and then you talk about whatever silly things, and then no progress happens and you move on. That's real. Or even worse, it becomes some type of infantile, Father, can I buy a car? I need a car for work, and you know I think that this car is right. Now if you're thinking about buying a luxury vehicle and you need somebody to like talk, like your conscience is troubling you, yeah, I guess you could bring that up. But I mean, I those types of relationships are toxic too, and that they happen. They're not a common occurrence, but they can happen when you in devout communities. And even directors can fall into allowing a penitent to become infantile. You should not have a relationship with your spiritual director. You should not. I don't want you reading Saint Catherine de Pazzi, the Carmelite, reading about how she asked permission to get a glass of water or something like that, and then going, I'm going to do that with my director, and don't do that with me either. All right. We live apart. We don't live in the same house. And even if we did, I first order of business would be 99% of the time to let you guys drink water as you felt like it. Although if it became excessive, I might speak up and say something. But, unless you're being tried in obedience as a novice, so don't become infantile with your director. And read this book if you want more details on this. He goes into great lengths. But don't read an old monastic book about people who live the common life and how intimate they were with the director and then try to copy that in the world. You have enough serious business to talk about them. Like how angry you get when people don't pick up around the house, or how miffed you are when children walk up and down the church aisles, or violent thoughts about, I don't know, sedition or whatever interior struggles you guys in particular struggle with. Talk about that, but don't bring up stuff like it's be embarrassed about it. Rely on a good director to help you provide guidance here. And look at my handout. Okay. We should not just run into our directors, say, what should I do? run out and do that thing. That may sound counterintuitive to having a director, okay? But especially when you're picking out a director, and I'm especially to Peter, maybe, and Chris here, you don't have a director yet. Don't be too eager to just want to follow every single piece of advice they give you. Quote, nor should we submit our ideas to him until we have fully considered whether they are well founded and whether we can justify them before God and in conscience. Hey, it happens. Sometimes we don't click or we don't communicate well with somebody. They tell us to do crazy things. I once saw an example of this abuse in person with a young woman who was in one of those Catholic universities. She had a so called director. I shouldn't be too hard on him. But he wanted to push somebody who was just falling over herself in front of boys into the religious life. And I wasn't her director, and maybe she was called, but she was just ready to like. I mean, she was horribly conflicted because she had deep feelings for a young man, and if she went into her director, he just dismissed her, and you know, oh no, you're going to be a nun. So that just because somebody takes on the position of being a director does not mean they have your best interests at heart either. They could be struggling with their own things. Priests can be bad people too. Priests can have blind spots. Saint Louis de Montfort was horribly abused by his directors. Saint Elizabeth of Hungary was horribly abused by her spiritual director. He was not a good man. And many people look back on that in horror, and they agree that her submission did help sanctify her, but you know. So look, we must take responsibility for our own action. That's what I'm getting to here on. Don't bring up stupid things. Don't be infantile. Don't think for one moment that that rule about desert fathers and falling with goats applies to us today. It doesn't. You're responsible for your own soul. If anything, the modern church has taught us in the last few years is that we can't just trust what comes from the pulpit or from any other cleric in the church and just assume that it has our best interests at heart. Right? Quote, my soul is continually in my own hands. Psalm 119, 109. All right? Ultimately, it is the Holy Ghost who guides the soul. 1 John chapter 2, verse 27. Obey the I don't remember the exact line, but it's if you obey the commandment, basically the Spirit will come to you and teach you. By the way, God I'm saying all these things because I'm assuming that, and I know the people here, you like the priests and you love the priests, and they're great people. And most traditional priests are our friends and our teammates in the same struggle. But I say these things because it can make people vulnerable to bad things. And I'm speaking also for a broad audience. Okay? So be wary. Don't uh, find somebody you can bare your soul to with a childlike confidence that you have adult, conversations with. But don't ever think that like you get off on your sins, or that if your conscience is deeply upset by some type of thing that they've told you to do, that you can just violate your conscience. Sometimes our directors do need to kick us in the pants. I'll give you a concrete example. I knew of a situation once where a woman married a non-Catholic against her director's advice, and she wound up being very unhappy. Well, she decided that she was going to start volunteering at the parish and the youth group, where there was a young, handsome man leader. And the director heard this and say, I don't want you doing it. I don't want you doing it. Now, she should have listened to her director. He'd known her for a long time, had her best interest. Oh, no, 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 please. So she did it anyway. And sure enough, what these youth meetings involve? Well, close proximity to a handsome, young, devout man and praying together. Very intimate act. What happened? She became convinced that her marriage with her husband was never genuine and that she needed an annulment so she could pursue a relationship with this other man. Okay? Okay. Quote, a false conception of obedience due to a spiritual direction has often misled souls, causing them to indulge in a false feeling of security, almost as if they had handed over their conscience entirely to the care of the director and had no further need of any initiative or spiritual things themselves. You'll see this with people. They love dispensations to do whatever evil they want. Well, my priest says it's okay to do birth control. My priest says I don't have to forgive that person. I don't have to do that. I was dispensed. Quote, St. Paul was quite willing to solve problems of conscience, but he did not regard it as a Christian ideal that we should be continually putting questions and relying on the authority of others. A constant desire for direction, an irresolute outlook that is always hankering after decisions by ecclesiastical authority, an uneasy clinging to the stole of one's confessor or director, such attitudes would be for him proof that a person had not yet come of age and lacked a sense of responsibility. I'm going to interrupt myself there. So when you see people running after Father, 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 that's not a good sign. It's not pious. Those people are in a bad state. Okay. The apostle of the Gentiles is therefore no supporter of that short sighted spirituality which sees in dependence in religious matters especially clear expression of the spirit of thinking with the church, and which thinks it is a good thing that the penitent should turn to his confessors for advice in every little difficulty. You know, sometimes all we need to do with our directors and confessors is say, pray for me, I struggle. That's it. You don't even need to go into a long thing. We oftentimes know what we need to do. Oftentimes, when we're even talking at people, it's only because we want to avoid doing the hard work. I can only speak for myself, but that's my experience. Anyway. Quote, the penitent should be docile and obedient to his director. Nevertheless, the obedience due to his spiritual director is not at all the same obedience which a religious subject shows to his legitimate superiors. A spiritual director has no ability to dispense you from obligations of the rule or of obedience to the grand master, preceptor, novice master, etc. Ever. Period. They can't look at our rule and say, I don't think you should have to do that much office. I don't think you should have to obey that. No, they're way out of line. Way out of line. And if they, I mean, that'd be almost like, I'll tell you what that would be similar to. That'd be equivalent of looking at somebody's wife who a husband has absolute authority over, saying, you don't have to obey your husband. It's a similar thing. Feel like looking at a monk of another community saying, you don't have to obey your abbot. Now, of course, if it's a sin, you don't have to do it. But sometimes on these practical matters, there's collusion. And I got to tell you, the Latin office is a real collision point with priests, even good priests. Well, I think that's too much. Well, you're not suited to be the director here. If you don't like it, fine. But leave us to our own business. We wrote our own rule. We got it approved by the church, approved by God. Thank you very much. Okay? A novice master should assist the novice in the practical aspects of living the rule and should be watching strictly over exterior activities, apostolates, the recitation of the office, and studying. A director should assist with interior activity. So, you can come to me about all those things. If you're struggling with some type of dark night of the soul kind of weird thing, go to your director. I'm, of course, always willing to be your friend, but I can only provide so much help there. A director is the more appropriate venue. Okay, if you're trying to struggle to figure out an apostolate, talk to me. If you want to know what to study, talk to me. If you want to know about how to conquer the demon of envy or something, talk to your director. Okay? Of course, you can talk to me too, but it's not the same. The graces will be more with the director. So this brings us around. So we just highlighted a difference here between what we get from our novice master, what we get from our director. And then we've also seen a very important point. No matter what, you're responsible for yourself. I think one of the reasons why you see so many devout Catholics ripping their claws of hair out of their heads about every time the Pope Pardon me. Every time person in ecclesiastical authority, since we have to include a lot of people today, says something that's not right, they lose their minds. Why? Because they don't want to have to think. They want to be able to pick up a catechism, point to it, and then stop thinking and go, well, the catechism says it, that's good enough for me. No, it doesn't work that way. Canonically speaking, canonically speaking, you have the obligation to study religion the rest of your life. It actually says so in canon law. The 83 Code, not even an old book, says that Christians should have to study Christian doctrine, not this is word for word, according to their ability for the rest of their life. And you know what? I don't have the same viewpoints I had when I was 18 years old. I'm 31 now. And that's about as long as I've been reading really adult Catholic literature. And I've only been doing it for 13 years. I've read fathers, I've read, St. Thomas, I've read medievals, I know about penitential man. And you know what? You learn a lot. And it does adapt your viewpoint and so forth. And hopefully you're reading things that are appropriate to you and that you're guided by grace and your directors and your order. But it's your responsibility. Okay. Now for the hard vow of obedience. Obedience, brings into submission not solely to God, but to rules and to superiors, that which we cling to most tenaciously, our own will. By this vow, the religious pledges himself to obey the commands of his lawful superior in all that concerns the vows and constitutions. There you go. That's what we're talking about in the order. If it concerns our vows or constitutions, you have to obey. That's what your vow of obedience is. It's not like the Grand Master is not going to show up to your house and be like, you know what? I think that picture should be on that wall, or I don't think you should drink lemonade. Okay? Here it is a question of formal commands and not mere advice. Now, he can say, I think that picture should be on that wall. I don't think you should drink lemonade. Okay? And I can look at you and say, I think you should get up at 6 a.m. to say lauds and do mental prayer. Notice I said, I think. That was not me binding you. Such a command is recognized by the formulas employed by the superior, for instance, when he commands in the name of holy obedience. We actually have a formula we have to follow. It should be clear to you when I say it that I'm demanding something in obedience. If I say something lighthearted, although I was serious when I said it, like, don't go to nightclubs in holy obedience, right? Not that that was ever a temptation for you, ever will. I was just making a broad remark. That is, it has to be clear to you. The very fact that I added levity to my remark, okay, indicated that it was it wasn't meant to be strictly understood. I'll give you a concrete example. In the Book of the Foundations by St. Teresa of Avila, one of my favorite books on religious life, there's a story about how superiors have to be very careful about making flippant or lighthearted remarks that are not sinful. One day, a group of these discalced Carmelite nuns were out in the garden doing work, and they found this huge worm, like this huge earthworm. And so this really amused one of the sisters. She brought it over to the Mother Superior, who was sitting down sewing. And she says, oh, Mother Superior, look at how, big this worm is. And the Mother Superior says, oh, yes, it looks so wonderful. You can eat it. And then the novice got this pale look on her face because she thought she'd just been told in obedience to eat it. So she opened up her mouth, and then the mother jumped up from her thing to tackle her to prevent her from eating the worm. Okay, so it needs to be grave, and that's why you'll see, like when the Grand Master wants to address us strictly, he writes a letter on letterhead, and he sends it to us, and he instructs us. When I'm dead serious about something, I oftentimes put it in a letter to you, not even an email. I'll put a letterhead on it, sign it, date it, and say, in obedience, or in the name, and another one is in the name of our Lord. You'll see when I sign formally emails, I'll say on our Lord Jesus Christ. That's saying, I'm superior on this, obey me, basically, in our Lord Jesus Christ. Okay? So it has to be clear that it's a formal order. If you don't know, ask. Is that a formal order? Get a grave look on your face so you can injure me if I'm being lighthearted or just joking. Anyway, the vow of obedience is one of the hardest things to human nature. It is. It makes everything hard. I bet if I ask somebody to get me a glass of water, they'd do it. If I say, I order you to get me a glass of water, it gets harder, doesn't it? There you go, because our pride rebels against being commanded, not requested. Consequently, that's why good superiors very reluctantly invoke holy obedience. Although during your novitiate, you may be tested. Just mentioning it. Okay. Spiritual directors, confessors, and fellow knights have a certain authority within their domain. When they speak within that frame, they should be obeyed. Therefore, he that resisteth the power resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist purge in themselves damnations. Romans chapter 13, verse 2. So, if you ever find yourself in a position of authority, your chief goal in using it is the glory of God and the common good. Quote, by the way, these previous citations were from the Spiritual Life. That book is amazing. It's huge. It's like this big. It is written by a Redemptorist American priest. It was absolutely ferocious at the time he wrote it. A copy of was given to me as a gift by a man who joined the SSPX seminary. Still there. And funnily enough, the Pope, our beloved Holy Father, Pope Francis, at his annual meeting with the Curia in December, where it has become an occasion for him to offer critiques of his staff or of the Vatican staff. At the end of ripping them to shreds, he actually gave them all a copy of this book as a gift, which amazed me. In Italian, it goes to show you how better things at a certain level have gotten in the church. He even advised them to look up the sins that they were committed and work on them one at a time, which was amazingly good advice. So anyway, quote, if a superior should go in commanding, go beyond the limits of his authority. For instance, if a parent should oppose the duly considered vocation of his child, he would be exceeding his rights and the child would not be bound to obey. Okay? Somebody's going beyond our domain. You're not obliged to obey. If I'm out of line, I hope you never thought I have been. You're not obliged to obey on that thing. Although it is helpful to communicate and realize that we're friends. Okay? Most of the time in the order today, very seldom, most of the time, the order is so polite and kind in the highest levels that generally a person's way out of line before any type of coming down happens. I mean, not to say it should ever get that far, but I've never seen ever the Italy go out of line, asking too much. I've never seen that today. So, all right. How important is obedience to the rule? Well, it's all over the place. Preferring to wear the most excellent armor of obedience. Prologue. And shall obey him, but their obedience shall not be recalcitrant and ready for rumors. On the contrary, it shall be frank, free, and loyal. Loathe your own will, obey the master. They shall therefore obey readily when an order has been given by the master or by the person authorized by him, which, by the way, means that when you obey me as your novice master or preceptor, or Dom Chris as your commander, or just the Ninth Spirit, you're obeying the Grand Master himself. When you obey the Grand Master himself, you're obeying Jesus Christ. It's that simple. If you have a problem with your novice master, superior, whatever, just remember, he's just a channel. That's all he is. for Jesus Christ. You can always take it to the next level. You can always go above his head and say, I don't like the way I'm being treated. And then you can proceed to be told by the next level to obey your superior anyway, unless they're out of line. And then they'll get a letter saying, hey, you went too far. Okay? So the whole thing falls apart if somebody refuses to be obedient, even over simple things. Our whole order falls apart. If we can't rely on one another to obey, then it's like pointless. If I, as preceptor, can't say to everybody, we're all going to meet, especially if I, try to do the right thing and serve the common good to make sure like all the brothers come together for a meeting. And then I call the meeting after everybody's told me the best time for them, right? Like if people flippantly disobey that, it's not just harming me, it's harming the whole brotherhood, right? If the Grand Master can't summon me to Italy, especially if he says, what time is good for you? If I can't see that, if I say, well, never, I could never go, how am I his subject then? Right? And that can happen. In theory, you have to ask yourself, are you willing to be subject to a man telling you where to go, even if that creates a burden for you? If the answer is no, then you can't be a knight. Okay, to quote St. Bernard here, to make this principle clear, we must note that some actions are wholly good, others wholly evil, and in these no obedience is to be rendered to men. For the former are not to be omitted by us, even if they are prohibited by men. So I can never look at you and say, don't pray and work. Okay. Nor the latter done, even though they are commanded. I can never look at you and tell you to commit adultery. Doesn't work. You shouldn't do it. But besides these, there are those actions between the two which may be good or evil according to the circumstances of place, time, matter, or person, and these obedience has its place, as it was in the matter of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which was in the midst of paradise. When these are in question, it is not right to prefer our own judgment to that of our superiors, so as to take no heed of what they order or forbid. So, for example, if our superiors say, after Compline, we're going to observe silence. They have a good reason for it, you should do it. It's not forbidding you from praying or doing anything bad, but they're saying, we're not going to visit right now. We're just going to go to bed, all right? Silence is not wholly good, and speaking is not wholly good. They can be good or evil depending on the situation. Faith, hope, charity, and others of that class are wholly good. It cannot be wrong to command or to practice them, nor right to forbid them or to neglect the practice of them. Theft, sacrilege, adultery, and all other vices are wholly evil. It can never be right to practice or to order them, nor wrong to forbid or avoid them. The law is not made for things of kind, but for the prohibition of no person has the power to render null the commandments given, nor the command of any to render lawful things prohibited. There are, finally, things of a middle kind which are not themselves good or evil. They may be indifferently either prescribed or forbidden, and these are an inferior, never sins in obeying. Such are, for example, fasting, watching, reading, and the such like. So St. Bernard says that you're never sinning if you're reading like a holy book. By the way, St. Bernard, when he was a young man, he obviously developed his own thoughts on this too, because once he wept bitter tears because he had not revealed to his spiritual father or asked permission to say the 7 penitential psalms. Such was the fragileness of young Bernard. Here is Bernard writing a letter as an older monk saying, can't forbid you to do that. Okay? We order forever that everyone respect this rule in every part, even in respect to what may be unjustly taken from you. Chapter 20. Which comes to this question. Now you're asking, all right, Noah, what if I decide to break my vow? What if I decide to disobey? Will I go to hell? Is it a grave sin? Let me help you. St. Thomas, however, justly remarks that one may sin grievously against the rule if one violates it out of contempt for the rule itself or contempt for superiors. One may sin lightly if the violation in question is due to voluntary negligence, passion, anger, sensuality, or any sinful motive. In this case, it is the motive that constitutes the fault. We may add with St. Alphonsus that the fault may be grave if the infractions are infrequent and deliberate, either because of the resulting scandal, which gradually leads to an appreciable weakening of discipline, or because the delinquent exposes himself to expulsion from the community to the great detriment of his soul. So, yes, it can be a mortal sin under certain circumstances. Yes, those circumstances, and by the way, I don't think this is as complicated as people make it. Okay, if you're in charge, for example, if we give you all our treasury money and then you refuse to give that money back to us to do good works with, that's either theft or extreme negligence. It's a sin. It's a grave sin because it's a grave matter, right? If you're late for Vespers or something, all right, no, right? So, we have to use our minds here. Um, we can sin, but oftentimes it's not breaking the rule, but it's all the surrounding factors, right? Theft is a sin in and of itself. The fact that it was done like under the knife, that makes it worse. Okay, so that's what you need to know. But please don't. I'll tell you that this wasn't clearly explained to me as a novice, and it led to times where, I mean, there are parts of our rule that, like admonitions, like deny yourself completely, or so forth. That like, or where I felt like if I wasn't choosing like to torture myself or something, then I was committing a sin, right? And that's not correct either. All right, but don't fall into this is an area, by the way, that you're not going to get a lot of help from priests on, even religious priests. I have yet to meet a religious priest. First of all, they immediately approach everything lay and they just go, you guys can't sin by having a rule. And I don't agree with that. I take my vows just as seriously. They were done in the most solemn context. I don't see how you can say that. Okay. Um, and then also St. Thomas, just to mention this, St. Thomas talks about this as well, where, and I've taken this out of the section where he talks about how rules are admonitions to perfection, and therefore breaking a rule does not, like, is not a sin, because that means people would be binding to themselves to something that would make it less likely for them to be saved. Right? So I'm giving you a piece here, but not the entire picture. The example that was used in this book a little further was the cloister. It was considered always a mortal sin for a nun to violate the cloister by bringing in a man, because that's a grievous temptation to her chastity, period, or to other nuns. So that's a mortal sin to violate the cloister. It's always been understood as a mortal sin to violate the cloister. I don't think a priest would look at a nun today and say, oh yeah, you can bring a man into the cloister, that's cool. Yeah. They wouldn't say that, unless they'd be like, was the man shot? You needed like 10 or something, right? Okay, so that's the way to look at this. Okay, here we go. We need to live the rule with a spirit of generosity. We shouldn't be just looking to, am I obeying the rule? Am I living the spirit of the rule? As for those that live in communities, the more generously they obey their rule and constitutions, the more perfect they are. There you go. You want to know how to become more perfect? Reread the 23-page rule. Same thing for your life. Strictly live that. That's where perfection lies for you. Nowhere else, it's in there, or it's directly somehow connected with what's in there. From the rest of your life, your rule is almost like your foundation block under which everything else is going to be built up now. It's your cornerstone, which you rest on. Your scripts, the way you read the scriptures, the way you hear mass, the way you say your prayers, even how you eat for the rest of your life, how you become perfect in those things, are guided by the rule. These rules are means of perfection which the church has explicitly or implicitly approved to the observance which a religious binds himself on entering the community. He, the true religious, observes the rule as perfectly as he can, knowing this is the best way of pleasing God. It ever remains true that to observe one's rule is the safest means of accomplishing God's will and of living for him. He who lives by the rule lives unto God. To fail willfully in this matter with no good reason is an abuse of grace. A lot of people don't know why they live, or the best they've gotten to is to know, love, and serve God. You have it much better made if you choose this way of life for the rest of your life. You'll know exactly what you're supposed to do and what you're exactly supposed to get better at. People have like the most aimless and stupid goals on earth. Even Olympians. And they have a concrete goal. Their goal is to become excellent and win a gold medal. And then it's all downhill from there. What do they there is no goal after that. What? Wheaties commercials? Teaching high school students? It's sad. That's as far as they can go. There's no end to this. You could be floating during the office and you're not done yet. You can go back to that rule, and that's exactly how you should guide your Lent. Is go back to the rule. What should I do this Lent? Look at the rule and then go from there. Okay. We see over this very long presentation, I'm sorry, it's probably going longer. No, it's doing okay. We see from looking at this that all these things are connected. We're obliged to say the office and do so with devotion. In order to say it with devotion, we need to do mental prayer. In order to do good mental prayer, we need to make resolutions and amend our lives. In order to get grace to amend our lives, we need to go to frequent confession, have a spiritual director. And what are you going to do there? You're mainly looking for how you can more closely follow the rule. And why are you praying the office? Because the rule told you to. This is why this is our first thing we're going over with you, because this is what you're obliged to do right now. We'll get more into the history of the order and things later. But all these things are connected. So if you say the office and you do your mental prayer, if you go to confession and then you go to your director, if you try to more perfectly live with the rule, it creates this cycle and you get momentum going.
Lex Orandi, Lex Credendi, Lex Vivendi,
basically, yeah. By the way, as soon as one of these things falls apart, it all falls apart. That's why you need all of them. You can't just go, I'll say the office, I'm not going to go to confession. I'll, do the mental prayer, but I'm not going to have a director. It begins to fall apart. By the way, like every person's vocation falls apart, you can always look at it and find what it is. Major decision without a spiritual director is a big one. Doing too much. Not trying to live out the rule. Not saying their office. Something creeped in. Everything was destroyed. And then followed by flagrant disobedience. Even on big things. Even on things that are explicit mortal sins. And then a superior tries to come in and help them back. And then we get attacked, denigrated, and slandered. Okay. All right. And it happens to good people too. What do I mean by good people? I mean people who are both likable and lovable and could show themselves to be excellent vessels of grace. Okay. We'll just ignore that. Okay, fasting. We're adding this section onto the end just because it's Lent, and I know you're all excited for it. Do not seek comfort, love fasting. One cannot love something if they habitually avoid it or try to avoid the spirit of it. Fasting is elevated by our Lord to such a degree, and so is it in almost every council, trend, other things, that when they're talking about overcoming vice, doing penance, fighting demons, they mention fasting before prayer. There's a lot of great quotes on fasting. I mean, almost every saint has a bushel of them. One of my favorites is where there is no prayer and fasting, there are demons. Saint Theophan the Recluse, that's in his work on the Holy Path to Salvation. There was one Egyptian Coptic who said that a Christian who doesn't fast is not a Christian, something to that effect. But you might be asking, Noah, what are we strictly obliged to do? Well, I hate to disappoint you because we very much leave this up to individual nights. When I became a novice, we were told that we were to follow the 62 rule of fasting. And this was done for a number of years in this preceptory. And then years later, it was mentioned in a letter to Italy by myself. And then they wrote back, they're like, well, that's great, but you're not obliged to do that. We follow the current code. Whatever the precepts of the church are for fasting and days of abstinence, that's what you're strictly obliged to, except you have to abstain from meat on all Fridays of the year, except um, when it falls on a solemnity that allows you to eat meat. And then also you fast before your investiture. And if you do simple, you do that, and then solemn, you do that. And then anytime your superiors order it. So like once you were asked to fast for an intention for the Grand Master, and we did. If we're asked to fast because of the death of somebody, we will. I could order a fast. Um, you can be punished via a fast, although I've never seen that happen. In theory, it could. Um, but that's what we're strictly obliged to do. However, as I was just saying, you cannot love something if you habitually avoid it. Okay. It is important to note, though, that our rule does explicitly say, they shall not exceed in discipline or unauthorized abstinence, so that the service to be performed shall not suffer as a consequence. So, brothers do need to speak with their spiritual director if they're going to engage in forms of self denial that may adversely affect their strength. Eating a restrictive diet, fasting a few days a week, etc., is not excessive. Subsisting on broth and bread or just on beer is. Okay? So this should give you a guideline. You do not, in my opinion, need to go to your director because you decided to fast the 40 days of Lent. That's silly. Of course, you can fast the 40 days of Lent. My goodness, the godless, the pagan Islamists, they can fast for 35 days, kind of. They do their thing. We can do it, especially with the modern form, the two collations. However, are you strictly obliged to? No. You don't have to confess that as a public fault. If you don't, you do something else. I would prefer you do. I think you get more out of the office and other things, but we don't bind anybody to do that. This was actually a big thing in the early order, just to mention it. I've read, although I don't remember where I read it, that they actually assigned brothers to watch like you ate in pairs at the table, and you were responsible for making sure the guy next to you ate enough. And I don't know if James of Vitria was a real person. I couldn't get that from the text. But in a history by Malcolm Barber of the Templar Order, James of Vitria was an example of a historic knight who fasted so much on bread and water that he enfeebled himself for the field of combat. He was used as like, I don't know, like what's that group they like to pick on today? The veterans, there's those BEMs, like shut up. You know who I'm talking about. Like anyway, I don't know if James of Vitria was like that guy because the medievals actually had a very similar sense of humor to us. I don't know if he was like a legend to highlight like excessive forms of piety or he was a Templar. But I know the Templars spoke about him and said, don't be James of Vitria. Don't be that guy.
Oh, yeah.
Okay? As I say here, the Ancient Brotherhood used to watch. Okay, so, and fasting was a huge part of the ancient order as well. It is important to remember they were a military order. So they did not keep the fasts. They were considered the strictest military order, period, in terms of penance and the way they lived their life. However, they still did not fast like the Cistercians did, for example. It was also a regular form of assigned penance for public infractions against the rule. What's a public infraction against the rule? Like damaging your equipment, being caught with your habit in a bad way, disobedience, and something minor. They fasted on bread and water on every Good Friday, just Good Friday. I have over here on the Common the works that I got this from. That was from the French rule translated by Malcolm Barber. By the way, as an interesting note, it was a really big deal, and I've read it in several rules, and I'm not clear on, because I've seen it translated two ways. It says it was very insistent that they either not eat with napkins or that they not eat with a tablecloth. Now, I know that they didn't eat with a tablecloth Because there's another section of the rule where it's really highlighting the importance of not eating with the tablecloth on Good Friday. I don't know why this was a great importance, but it was. No tablecloth. And consequently, on Good Friday was the only time they were allowed to basically eat their bread, get up, and walk out. They didn't have to ask for permission to leave the table.
Because they would hide some of their food.
Maybe.
Go to like wipe their mouth, but they're really spitting out food.
Oh, no.
They have to watch each other eat to begin with.
Maybe. I don't know. It's anyway. No napkins. No tablecloth. And then I'm going to just read here. I found the section since it's a little bit more complete. I wrote it up here for people to see. Okay. The fasts that the brothers of the temple should observe are these. That is to say, they should fast every Friday from the Feast of All Saints until Easter. So they fasted every Friday. Except on the Friday which falls during the octave of Christmas. By the way, you have to give up meat during the octave of Christmas. Sorry, it's not a solemnity. We don't eat meat on Friday. Go out and have some fish or shrimp or something. And if the Feast of Christmas falls on a Friday, all the brothers should eat meat in honor of the Feast of Christmas. Of course, you're allowed to eat meat on Friday, on Christmas, and at these times, it says here, and also on the Feast of Epiphany, the purification of Our Lady or St. Matthias, if the apostle falls on a Friday. I don't know why St. Matthias, the apostle, got that special treatment. Maybe they had a special devotion to him. The brothers are not obliged to fast. In addition, all the brothers of the temple are required to observe 2 large fasts a year. I added large. And the first fast always begins on the Monday before the Feast of St. Martin, which is in November. That was a historic form of fasting, and they still do it in the East. St. Martin started the St. Martin's fast, which was a much longer period of fasting. It was like Advent, which is in November, and they should fast until Christmas Eve. The other fast should always begin on the Monday before Ash Wednesday, and they should fast until Easter Eve. So they ended it on Holy Saturday. Each brother is required to fast on the eve of Epiphany, the eve of St. Matthew the Apostle, St. Mark's Day, the eve of St. Philip and St. James, the 2 apostles, the 3 days before Ascension, the eve of Pentecost, the eve of St. John the Baptist, the eve of St. Peter and Paul, 2 apostles, the eve of St. James the Apostle, the eve of St. Lawrence, the eve of St. Bartholomew the Apostle, the eve of St. Matthias Apostle, the eve of St. Simon, St. Jude Apostles, the eve of St. Andrew Apostle, and the eve of St. Thomas Apostle. The brothers of the temple are also required to observe 4 fasts. The first on Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday after Ash Wednesday, another on Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday after Pentecost. The third on Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday after the exaltation of the Holy Cross in September. We call these Ember Days, by the way. And the fourth and last on Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday after St. Lucy the Virgin. I thought I'd throw that in there. I don't know what that was for. St. Lucy's fast? I'm not sure. And the brothers of the temple should not observe any other fast without permission. So they have the same rule. Nor may they accept the Fridays and other fasts with which they are charged in the chapter, and those that do not observe with the permission of, but rather by the order of the chapter. But if they are charged with fasting on Fridays for penance or any other fast, they should keep it, and anyone may do so without permission, except the confessor. Okay. So there you go. That was the ancient order fasts. Oh, by the way, I also found that in Reginald Pernaud, her book by Ignatius Press, they also fasted before the election of the Grand Master for 3 days. Brothers in the night, on bread and water, I believe. Brothers in the nights abstain from the, oh, here we go. Okay, so you are obliged on all Fridays throughout the year to not eat meat, unless it falls on a solemnity, which explicitly dispenses from meat. Okay, so Christmas Day, Solemnity of the Sacred Heart are 2 examples. You're allowed to eat meat. You don't have to eat meat, but you can eat meat. During the normative part of the year, you can ask a dispensation. So you can't ask for it during Lent, obviously. But according to my reading of everything, is that you can technically ask for me a dispensation from that on another Friday of the year. I don't know why you ever would ask, unless you were traveling or you were with somebody, or you're like, you had to go to a wedding and you were going to be served food and you didn't want to be a pain. All right, that's it. All right. So, but don't ask unless there's a real reason for it. I want to eat a cheeseburger. No, like, come on. Eat a fish fillet sandwich or something. There's so much crud you could eat nowadays It's not meat. We really don't have it that bad. The ancient order had a very complete diet according compared to their Cistercian counterparts. Just in case any of you felt like you had to eat fish for the rest of your life, they ate beef, mutton, veal, goat's meat, trout, eels, cheese, and vegetables. They're all mentioned in various documents. That's from Malcolm Barber and his great work on the Templars. And then they ate meat about 2 to 3 times a week. Believe it or not, the fully professed got to eat meat more frequently than the non. I don't know why. Maybe because they were nobles. Oftentimes, they just got it more often. They were allowed to eat meat twice on Sunday, so 2 to 3 days during the week, and then sometimes twice on Sundays. And they love cheese. That's from the Ignatian Press book. Apparently, the Templars just ate tons of cheese. Just mentioning that, thought it was fun. If I had to tell you to do something during this Lent, and I had to direct you to an area that I think you should pay great attention to, it is what the rule says in concerning eating. It says that you should never rise from the table fully satisfied. I'm not saying this so you don't fast. I want you to fast too. But this particular ability to rise from every meal, no matter how festive, no matter what a big feast day it is, no matter how good the food is or how great the company, not fully satisfied. It's hard. It ruins buffets. I'm just letting you know. For the rest of your life, you have to look at these places and go, I don't know if I should eat here. Maybe I shouldn't. Because the problem with buffets is it's not just about eating food, it's about making sure you eat enough food to justify the money you spent on it. Like you want to beat them at their game, right? At least this is my own cynical, thrifty, yeah. Anyway, but nothing you should ever be eating out ever. You should be at home crying and eating only lentils and bread. But this challenge is real. By the way, I was looked all over for I couldn't find it. It was in one of the unfortunately the website councilofttrent.com, which I've used for years, is now the domain expired, so the website's down. I guess they forgot to renew it. But it was great. You could search for the Council of Trent. And there was one of the sessions where the followers said this. They said, a man who is full does not even know what prayer is. Have you ever tried to pray on a full stomach? You can't well. You try to pray after you've had too many drinks? You can't well. All right? That's why, be sober and watch. All right? Don't be one of those people who has a God in the belly. This part of her rule is important too. Try to make it this struggle during Lent never to rise from the table fully satisfied. That's particularly hard if you've been faithful to fasting and you get to your one meal a day. Make sure the portion you take leaves you unsatisfied. That means you show up to the table looking for a little rest from your lack of satisfaction, and then you leave unsatisfied. But this is real religion. Consequently, I also speak a little from experience. St. Bernard puts it, hard living makes men hungry, soft living makes men dainty. Why don't we like the food that we eat? I'll tell you why. We're not hungry enough. When you're hungry, my wife used to hate this when I do this in my first marriage. She'd say, how do you like the food? I said, oh, it's great. I'm so hungry. Right? Because she knew what that meant. What that meant was I was so hungry, it didn't matter what I was served. Starving, right? It's the same idea in that, if you, when you're thirsty, water is perfectly acceptable. If you don't live a hard life, you may need expensive wine, I guess, or something for the subtleties, but a man who lives a hard life, he's perfectly satisfied with $2 chuck and cheap beer. To get him through the night, to put a little joy back in those cheeks. Okay, it's the same idea. If you deprive yourself of food habitually, it actually brings greater, your life is had more abundantly. You do appreciate what you eat more. You do give greater thanks to God. And then you also realize that in this life, we will never be fully satisfied. And just like how I would love to keep talking, I'm going to end this note not fully satisfying my desire to speak many words. And I'm going to move this over now to questions. Um, let me exit out of that. And does anybody have any questions?
I do.
Okay.
So, going back to spiritual direction, but let's say your spiritual director assigns you some spiritual reading, your novice reading would take priority over that, right?
If the novice reading was done like with if I say please have X done by X date, yes. If it's open ended, like read the life of Saint Bernard when you can, no. I would just say, you know, you should still read the life of Saint Bernard, but maybe you just one day you read the life of Saint Bernard, one day you read what your spiritual director gave you to read. That's what I would say. But yeah, anything that we say to do by a date, you should give preference to us.
Okay.
Unless it's like mission critical. And then you can talk to me. You can always say, "Can I have more time?" Because my spiritual director asked me to read X, Y, and Z before our next meeting, and I didn't get it done.
Okay.
I'm trying to get up the chat window right now if there's questions on the chat. Oh, here we go. Yes, I would say for sure that to try to find a director in person if possible before looking for a director via correspondence, Peter. Um, uh, yeah, and like I said, what I would do. I mean, if you can, we can talk about that more in particular. But yes, I would definitely say exhaust the local area first before going out. And if you can, even if you were to go out and correspond it, I'd try to keep it in the same time zone just for convenience, because that makes the possibility of a phone call more realistic. So does that answer your question? I'll take the non-real time response as a yes. Okay. Um, Anybody else? Okay, good. No? Okay. Well, on that note, let us end with a prayer in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, one God. Amen. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven.
Give us today our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.
Our Lady, Queen of the Militia,
Pray for us.
in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, one God. Amen. My friends, I'm going to find that link. I'm going to end the I'm going to leave the cast on for just one quick moment, and I'm going to put up that link to the spiritual direction document. You just hang on one quick moment. Thank you very much for watching and got. Oh, yes, Peter, the next meeting will be next weekend, so we stay on schedule. That is correct. And that will be on the last part of the 12 steps to humility. And I'm depending on how long that takes, I may also introduce the next work. We're going to be going over in praise of the new night by Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, which is a short work. I mean, you could read it definitely in an hour, but we're probably going to talk about it at length. I'm going to examine certain historical things he says at length I'm going to talk about how we live by the spirit of it, and also maybe some areas of tension that existed between what Saint Bernard envisioned for the Templars to be and then what they actually became. So, anyway, God bless and have a good night.